I was standing in my own conference room when my nephew told the entire leadership team that my methods belonged in a museum. He said it with a smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and then he turned to the VP of operations and asked if anyone had explained to me how cloud infrastructure actually worked. The room went silent. I set down my coffee and looked at him across the table. He was 29 years old and wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. I nodded once and returned to the quarterly projections on the screen. That was the moment I knew exactly what I was going to do. I had built my logistics company from a single van and a cell phone 15 years earlier. We moved freight across the Midwest with precision that larger firms envied, and by the time I turned 45, we had 200 employees and contracts with manufacturers who trusted us with their supply chains. I was not a man who shouted or gestured wildly. I moved through my days with the economy of someone who understood that noise was not the same as substance. My sister's son had joined us 2 years prior with an MBA and a confidence that seemed to fill every room before he did. I had hired him because my sister asked and because I believed in second chances. He had been let go from 2 previous positions for reasons that were never entirely clear. The morning after that meeting, I arrived at the office an hour before sunrise. The building was quiet except for the hum of servers in the back room and the buzz of security lights in the parking lot. I made coffee in the small kitchen and sat at my desk with a legal pad. I wrote 3 names at the top: my nephew's name, my attorney's name, the name of the firm that handled our annual audits. Then I began to map out what needed to happen. My nephew's entitlement had been growing for months. He had started referring to himself as the heir apparent in conversations with junior staff. He made jokes about my age at company dinners, always framed as affection, always delivered with just enough edge that people looked away. He had begun arriving late to meetings and leaving early, delegating his responsibilities to others while taking credit for their work during reviews. I watched it all with the patience of someone who had spent decades managing supply chains and understood that systems reveal themselves under pressure. The inciting moment came 3 weeks later during a client presentation. We were pitching a contract renewal to a manufacturing firm that represented 18% of our annual revenue. My nephew had insisted on leading the presentation. I sat in the back of the room and watched him stumble through slides he had not reviewed, misquote our delivery metrics, and promise timeline commitments that our operations team could not meet. The client thanked us politely and said they would be in touch. As we walked to the parking lot afterward, my nephew clapped me on the shoulder and said that he thought it went well, that the old ways of doing business were finally being retired. I unlocked my car and drove home in silence. That evening, I called my attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had handled my corporate filings since the beginning. I explained that I wanted to restructure my succession plan and create a conditional inheritance framework for the company. She listened without interrupting and then asked me if I was certain. I told her I had never been more certain of anything. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday. Over the next 2 months, I built the architecture quietly. I met with Patricia 6 times. We drafted documents that transferred ownership of the company to my nephew upon my retirement, but embedded within the operating agreement were performance benchmarks and accountability structures that would activate automatically. If gross revenue fell below a certain threshold for 2 consecutive quarters, an independent board would convene to review leadership. If client retention dropped below 85%, the same board could initiate a management audit. If employee turnover exceeded industry averages by more than 15%, the board had the authority to restructure executive compensation and responsibilities. The board members were 3 individuals I trusted: Patricia, our lead auditor, and a retired logistics executive who had mentored me years earlier. My nephew would not know they existed until the conditions triggered their involvement. I also restructured our internal systems. Every client contract now required dual authorization for changes. Every operational promise made to a customer had to be logged and verified by the ops team before it left the building. Financial draws above a certain amount required board notification. I framed these changes as efficiency upgrades and risk management protocols during a staff meeting. My nephew was on his phone through most of it. I told my sister about my retirement plans over Sunday dinner at her house. She looked surprised and asked if I was feeling all right. I smiled and said I was tired and ready to let the next generation take over. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said that her son had always looked up to me. I nodded and finished my meal. The formal announcement came in September. I gathered the company on a Friday afternoon and told them I would be stepping down at the end of the year. There was applause and some visible shock. I introduced my nephew as the incoming CEO and said I had every confidence in his ability to lead us forward. He stood up and gave a short speech about innovation and disruption and thanked me for building something worth inheriting. Afterward, people shook my hand and asked if I was sure. I told them I was. The transition period lasted 8 weeks. I handed over every password, every client relationship, every operational detail. I introduced him to our key accounts personally and sat beside him during the meetings while he spoke. Some clients asked me quietly if everything was all right. I assured them it was. I trained him on our dispatch software, our inventory tracking protocols, our payroll systems. He nodded through most of it and took almost no notes. When I asked if he had questions, he said he would figure it out. My last day was December 20th. The staff threw a small party in the break room with cake and a plaque. My nephew gave a toast about legacy and gratitude. I shook hands with people I had worked beside for over a decade and walked out to my car with a cardboard box of personal items. I drove home and sat in my kitchen with a glass of water. The house was quiet. I did not feel sad. I felt like someone who had set a trap with great care and was now waiting for the mechanism to spring. The first cracks appeared in February. I heard about them through my attorney, who received automated reports from the auditing firm as part of the oversight structure. Client complaints had increased by 40%. 2 mid-level managers had resigned without explanation. My nephew had fired the head of dispatch after a disagreement about delivery schedules and replaced him with someone who had no logistics experience. Revenue projections for the first quarter were tracking 15% below forecast. I did not call. I did not visit the office. I had removed myself entirely and made it clear to the staff that I was retired and unavailable for consultation. My nephew called me once in March and asked if I had a moment to discuss some operational challenges. I told him I was confident he would work it out and wished him well. He paused on the line and then thanked me and hung up. By April, the dashboards I had access to through the board reporting structure showed the situation clearly. 3 major clients had not renewed their contracts. Employee turnover had spiked to 28%, nearly double the industry average. My nephew had begun making unilateral decisions about equipment purchases and facility upgrades without consulting the operations team or reviewing cash flow projections. He had hired 2 of his former college friends into senior positions and given them salaries that exceeded what our veteran staff earned. The company's net income had turned negative for the first time in 8 years. The board convened in early May. Patricia called me the night before and asked if I wanted to attend. I told her I did not. She said the metrics were clear and the operating agreement gave them the authority to act. I thanked her and asked her to proceed as the documents outlined. The audit took 3 weeks. The board reviewed every contract, every financial transaction, every personnel decision made since January. They interviewed staff confidentially and reviewed client feedback reports. The findings were compiled into a 20-page document that was delivered to my nephew on a Tuesday morning. I was not there, but Patricia called me that afternoon and described his reaction. He had been stunned. He had argued that the business was in a transition phase and that revenue would stabilize. He had accused the board of undermining his authority. Patricia had listened and then explained that the operating agreement he had signed gave the board the power to restructure leadership when performance thresholds were breached. She offered him 2 options: step down as CEO and transition to a consulting role with a significant pay reduction, or remain as CEO under the direct supervision of an interim operations officer appointed by the board. He had asked for time to think. He called me 2 days later. His voice was tight and controlled. He asked if I had known about the board structure. I told him I had designed it. He asked why. I said that leadership was not inherited, it was earned, and that respect was built through competence and humility, not entitlement and dismissal. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I had humiliated him. I told him he had done that to himself. He hung up. He chose to step down. The board appointed the retired logistics executive I had selected as interim CEO. Within 60 days, client retention began to stabilize. The executive rehired the dispatch manager my nephew had fired and restructured the operations team. Employee morale improved. 2 of the major clients who had left agreed to return under new terms. By the end of the 3rd quarter, the company was profitable again. My nephew moved to another state. My sister called me once and said I had been cruel. I told her I had been clear. She said family was supposed to support each other. I said support was not the same as enabling failure. She did not call again. I spent my retirement working in my garden and consulting part-time for small logistics firms that needed help with scaling operations. I did not miss the daily grind of management, but I missed the people I had worked with. Some of them reached out and we stayed in touch. They told me the company was in good hands now and that the culture was recovering. A year after I retired, the board offered to sell me back a minority stake in the company. I declined. I had built it once, and that was enough. What I had needed to prove was simpler than ownership. I needed to show that humility mattered, that expertise was not obsolete, and that dismissing someone for their age or their methods was a choice that carried consequences. I still see my nephew's face sometimes when I close my eyes, the way he looked at me across that conference room table with a smile that had no warmth. I think about the many ways I could have handled it differently. I could have fired him. I could have confronted him directly and demanded an apology. I could have warned him that his behavior would cost him, but none of those paths would have taught him what he needed to learn. He had to discover on his own that arrogance without substance collapses under its own weight, and that the systems built by people who know what they are doing do not forgive incompetence just because someone believes they are entitled to succeed. The company still operates under a version of the oversight structure I designed. The current CEO kept it in place because it works. Accountability is not a punishment. It is a framework that protects everyone, including the person in charge. I am 63 now. I wake early and drink coffee on my porch and watch the sky lighten over the trees. I do not regret what I did. I gave my nephew an opportunity to lead, and I gave him every tool he needed to succeed. What I did not give him was immunity from the consequences of his choices. That was the inheritance that mattered.